I noticed this crazy thing, and I don't know if you did too, that there are a lot of serial killers, like a crazy amount of serial killers, that come from the Pacific Northwest or the Northwest part of the United States. Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, Israel Keyes, just to name a few. Why? Why is this the case? Is it totally random, or is there something more to it? Caroline Fraser has some pretty compelling theories. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner and author of the new book, Murderland, which explores just this question: why are so many serial killers from the Northwest? It's also a fascinating meditation on serial killers and how we look at them. She gave us some time, and I think we got some answers. So let's get right into it. This is Deviant, Off Script. Carolyn, as I sit here and hit record, there's a thunderstorm happening outside where I am here in Florida, and I think that sort of perfectly sets the mood for the discussion we're about to have about your wonderful book, Murderland. And there's so much that is in this book. It's not just a book about serial killers. It's not just character studies or case studies. And I shouldn't even say it's not just that. It's not that. And with the thunderstorm that's about to happen, I think it's important that we set the mood here. And I'll set them up and you knock them down, I think, when it comes to this. So there's a central thesis in the headline out there about your book is, why do so many serial killers come from the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest? And when I think about that, and as I ponder your book, I think about the first thing that popped into my mind was, I know you wrote this 30 years after the fact, but Twin Peaks is the sort of the vibe that I get from this sort of spooky part of the country. You were born in this area, and at the beginning of the book, you draw a line, and you, I believe, were born in the middle of this line, but in that line, you have Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. And this is where you start things. And when did this realization sort of happen? How did this project start taking shape for you? What were you out to get?
Yeah, I mean, I really started with that question, the question about why are there so many serial killers in the Northwest, because it was something that I'd been thinking about for a long time and wondering whether there was anything to it or if it was just kind of an urban myth or something, that people gossiped about. But I started there and started looking at, how many of these incidents were there? How many of these killers were there? And quickly came to realize that there was a specific period of time, that I was looking at, the 1970s and 80s, which is when I was growing up near Seattle. And there were all these, notable cases around then. There was Ted Bundy, which happened when I was a teenager. There was the Green River Killer, who we don't even know exactly when he started, but probably late 70s or early 80s. And Charles Manson was incarcerated in that area for a while. And, as I kind of started looking at the lists of these guys who were out there in this period, I was struck by how many there were, but also how, to use the term associated with your show, how deviant they were. These cases were so bizarre and really kind of off the scales in terms of the amount of violence and the kind of violence. And I was really wondering, what could have happened to have caused this phenomenon, if it is a phenomenon. So that was really kind of where I started. And then I began sort of investigating possible causes and looking into something that I describe in the book, the so-called lead crime hypothesis.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that hypothesis and sort of set it up there and kind of trickle down.
Yeah, when I began working on this, I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know about the history of the region where these guys, many of them are associated with the city of Tacoma, which is quite near Seattle. It's only about 30 miles south of Seattle. And a lot of these guys grew up there or lived there for significant periods. Bundy grew up there. Ridgway grew up just east of SeaTac Airport. And as I said, Manson was incarcerated right off the coast in Puget Sound, off the coast of Tacoma. And a number of the other people that I talk about had some connection to that area. So I started looking at that and thinking, what went wrong in Tacoma?
Yeah.
And Tacoma was always this. I mean, the one thing that everybody knew about it was that it smelled really bad. There were all these jokes about the aroma of Tacoma because there was all this heavy industry there. And a lot of that smell was associated with the pulp mills that were there, but there were lots and lots of other factories and refineries, and most infamously, there was a lead and copper smelter right on the shore, right in the middle of the city, that was putting tons of lead into the atmosphere. And the crime rate in the 70s and 80s really skyrocketed, both in Tacoma and in the Northwest, but also in the rest of the country as well. And so when scientists saw that, an epidemiologist, they're looking at this sharp rise in violent crime. And then in the 90s, you start seeing that crime rate drop off also quite sharply, which nobody had ever seen that before. And so to develop a theory about why this might have happened, the rise and the subsequent fall off in crime, and there have been multiple theories to try and explain it, but one of them was something that scientists called the lead crime hypothesis, which was that the amount of lead in the atmosphere really affected people. And there was lots of lead at that time because there was the sale of leaded gasoline and also lead from smelters.
And that was also a pretty heavy industrialized area when all this came about because of the production happening in World War II and the immediate post-war era, too. There was a lot of that going on. A lot of stuff in the air, a lot of stuff in the ground. Yeah.
Right. And the one thing that they knew about lead was that lead can lead to hyper-aggression. If you're exposed to it as a kid, if you're exposed to it sort of regularly, even as an adult, it can lead to criminal behavior, juvenile delinquency. There are many studies that have shown this because there are changes in your neurological development in the frontal cortex that diminish your ability to kind of control your own impulses.
Yeah, and all these names we mentioned grew up in that area or near it. And one thing I'm thinking of, and listeners to this show will be familiar with this, is we did a series about the serial killer Israel Keyes. Born in Colville, Washington, after Manson and Bundy and Ridgway. He was born a generation after them. But Colville is interesting. It's sort of east and north of the Seattle-Tacoma area. I think they share lots of waterways. But Colville, Israel Keyes came from there, yes. But if you look at Colville, for this small town, many other killers came from this area too. You had Chevy and Shane Kehoe, right? You had William Lebke. Most recently, Charles Lloyd Tatum was arrested for the alleged killing of two victims originally attributed to Israel Keyes in the 90s, right? And so this one little town in this one little area, killers keep coming out of. It's just such a strange area. And, geography is a big part of your book, right? And geography and environment, and you say, and I love this line, nature is a serial killer. And I think you're right. Nature is the ultimate serial killer. And part of that nature and part of that geography is really compelling. You introduce to readers the Olympic Wallowa liniment, the OWL, which is easier for me to say, which is this, some would say coincidence, some would say real feature of geography that runs through Washington. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the connections you see?
Yeah, this is a strange kind of image. This cartographer who was drawing a very, very detailed map of Washington State and the Northwest discovered in the 1940s, after he'd drawn this sort of magnificently detailed map, that there appeared to be a kind of a line that extended slantwise, beginning at, the very top northernmost tip of Washington state, and then cutting down through the state, that was really created by a sort of absence of features almost, so that when he just sort of discovered this when he glanced across the map from the side and realized there was created by this kind of trough almost in the geography that there appeared to be what looked kind of like a fault line, and probably is some remnant of a fault line. We now know, of course, which they didn't in the 1940s, that Washington State and Seattle are crisscrossed by all kinds of very alarming fault lines. There have been recent earthquakes there. It turns out to be a very seismically active place, far more than they knew. And I guess I'm using the owl, as they call it, as an example of something that is a mystery. We don't know whether it's there or not. We don't have a definition for it. We can't explain it. And so you can choose to believe that it's caused by a fault line. You can choose to believe that it's really nothing at all. And this, I think, is kind of an image of the problem that I'm posing about serial killers. Is there a theory that explains them or not? Is it just random or not? And we don't know. I can't prove the lead crime hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. I mean, nobody really knows, and nobody.
And I know you're not drawing some sort of mystical parallel for the owl to serial killers, but the first thing that struck me when I looked at the map and I looked at that line is that the line starts in sort of the northwest Nia Bay area and cuts diagonally down through Ellensburg, through the Hanford nuclear plant, through Walla Walla, all of those places, excepting the Hanford plant, associated with Israel Keyes or potential killings of him. He lived for a long time in Nia Bay after he got out of the army. A strongly suspected victim of his went missing from Ellensburg, but also in that era there are plenty of native women who go missing as well. But yeah, it's just a spooky coincidence, and it probably just is that, a coincidence. But I think using it as a metaphor is a brilliant way to kind of talk about the way we think about serial killers and the way we mythologize them and the way we consume news and information about them. And you have a lot to say, beautifully and lyrically written, and I'm a nerd about your writing in this book. Just sort of extending that metaphor. When we look at serial killers as a society, what do you think we see?
Well, I think human beings are just naturally fascinated by murder to begin with, and always have been. All of our literature is full of murder.
True crime is the oldest genre. That's
Yes, it's so true. I mean, the Bible is full of murders. So, when you think about that, and then you take the serial killers who are the end, one end of the spectrum, and so full of mystery in the sense that, why did they do what they do? Why are they compelled to do it? Because, once you've read enough about it or read enough of these cases, it's clear that there's some urgency compelling them to reenact this sequence of events kind of over and over again in almost like a robot-like way. And I think that is fascinating to us in terms of trying to understand the behavior, because most people just can't. I think most people can relate to, somebody who murders somebody for money or for, in the heat of the moment loses their temper or something like that. But these planned murders or murders that are so strongly motivated by sexuality, are very hard, I think, for people to understand and really kind of terrifying.
Yeah, serial sexual predators are, the 0.1% of murders that happen, but they get 90% of the attention, it seems like. And, I've always wondered why that's the case. And I also think there's an element of vicarious danger to it for people who consume this stuff. I mean, I shouldn't say people who consume this stuff. I do, right? I find this stuff fascinating, but also I think there's something telling in the choice of the narratives we choose to consume about serial killers. We're drawn to the most lurid details. We're drawn to the words of the killers themselves. And we tend to diminish the perspective of the victims and of the people who fall prey to these, and almost, do the killer's will in objectifying them in a way. I know I'm sort of just expounding here, but, this is something that really bothers me in the way we talk about serial killers. And before I ask the question that I'm taking the longest possible route to, one thing that we've learned about serial killers in our exploration of them in our show, when we do tackle them, is that serial killers lie. They craft their own narratives, they tell their own stories in the way that they want them told. And we buy it hook, line, and sinker. That's our preferred narrative. There's a minimum of journalism to it. Why do you think those are the primary voices we're listening to?
I think that one way I would address that question is to say something about the fact that true crime, in terms of its audience, has really evolved in a different direction in the last, 30, 40 years. I mean, it used to be aimed almost entirely at men. It was produced by men, and men consumed it as almost a kind of softcore porn, that it was titillating and
the old detective comics and all that
yes,
stuff. Yes,
detective magazines and so forth, which were huge sellers for a while in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And then there was this big shift, beginning perhaps with Anne Rule and The Stranger Beside Me, her book about Bundy. She tended to pay a lot more attention to the victims, describing their lives, who they were, and really empathizing with their experience. And from then on, you see a lot of women becoming part of the audience and also producing, true crime books and podcasts and so forth. And I think that has a lot to do, and we know this from polling, that women say that one of the reasons they're drawn to true crime is because they're afraid. They're afraid of crime happening to them. And yes, it is incredibly rare for women to have had an experience of this kind with a serial killer. Yeah. But a lot of women have had experience of violence in some other part of their lives, whether it's domestic violence, stalking, or just being afraid of, certain areas, walking at night. I mean, there are so many women who've had that experience and empathize with it. And there is somehow an idea that if I know about this, if I know about this topic, if I do some research, if I am aware of why these guys do what they do, I will somehow be protected. And that may not be a rational, response. I don't know that it really helps.
Yeah, and maybe the instinct is like, if you understand something, you fear it less, or if you understand something, you can know how to fight it, right? And there is a logic to that. Like, we fear the unknown, so maybe we'll fear less if we have more known, right? And you're right. Like 80% of the true crime audience is female, and oddly enough, our show here, Deviant, we're an outlier. We are only 65% female. So shout out to the 35% of the gentlemen who are listening to this. We appreciate you being here. But in your book, you talk about this concept of that sort of detective board that detectives stare at in the TV shows, or that beautiful
wall.
mind type of sequence. The crazy wall. Yeah. And obviously you made a crazy wall for Washington State and the killers there. Have you expanded that concept to make the connection between metals and lead and toxins to other killers or other places within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I started with the Northwest, but then gradually kind of expanded it a little bit to include other places in the West and other chapters in the history of particularly that one company, ARCA, American Smelting and Refining Company, which owned the smokestack and smelter in Tacoma. But then I was looking at how, they owned things all over the West. They owned particularly a very impressive smokestack and smelter in El Paso, Texas. And I thought, well, there's no serial killer associated with El Paso, is there? And then quickly found out that in fact there was. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, there is. Yeah. And that would be right. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Who I never associated with Texas because he committed his murders mainly in California, in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And so I had never associated him with El Paso. But of course, it turns out that he grew up there and that he lived in the plume, as they called it, that was created by the smokestack there. And also, that's the city of El Paso is right next to the city of Ciudad Juarez, because it's right on the border with Mexico. And Juarez has also developed a terrible reputation and had a terrible history of what they called femicides, of the murders of women there, which are doubtless associated with cartel violence. But they also think that there may have been several serial killers operating there.
Here's one more data point to add to the El Paso serial killer mix. I only learned this today as I was preparing for this interview. So Richard Ramirez had a cousin named Miguel Valles, who is also from that area. And Miguel Valles, very little out there about him, we may do a story about him, was a serial killer in Vietnam when he was a soldier over there. He used the area as almost a permission structure to do what he did, and he documented it all. And he came back and he took little 12-year-old Richard Ramirez under his wing and showed him all that stuff, and perhaps got the ball rolling in that direction. So there's another one for the El Paso.
It is, and it's a really suggestive case of that makes you wonder: is there something to the lead crime thing?
Yeah, and it's easy to make these connections, and I of course it would need like a peer-reviewed scientific study, but to know what's real and what's not cognitive bias, right? And but it's fascinating stuff. And you take us to California too with Ramirez, but you also, in your book, you also talk about Edmund Kemper, who has had a renaissance as of late with the Mindhunter show. And Kemper is, talk about a master of crafting your own mythology. Bundy was great at that, but Kemper was too. What attracted you to Kemper and talking about him, and why did you want to include him in this?
Well,
narrative?
like Bundy, he, as you are saying, is incredibly eloquent in describing himself and his actions, and so he's interesting from that point of view. And in terms of what we know about him, I mean, I just sort of mentioned him kind of in passing because he did live in Helena, Montana, another place that had exposures. I mean, and again, Kemper is, like so many of these guys, somebody who was subjected to a lot of violence within his family. His mother was sort of a crazy child abuser and locked him in the basement, and doubtless that contributed to making the sort of, monstrous behavior that he then exhibited. But yeah, I just, Kemper and the Zodiac Killer, for example, I just think it's so interesting to see how these guys may have had some exposure to lead on top of whatever else was going on with them. I mean, we don't even know who the Zodiac Killer was. We don't know what happened to him or what created him, but became sort of a parlor game in terms of trying to see if these guys had exposure on top of whatever else was going on with them. But I just, found it so fascinating that with a lot of these guys, you can find something.
I think as you're exploring these you picked out, sort of how our justice, legal, psychiatric systems and how they work or don't in this case. Like how did you weave that into all this? Or what were you looking to weave? And what did you find, I suppose, is a better way to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that just leaps out at you now with the benefit of hindsight, with all these guys in the 1970s, particularly, which of course is pre-DNA, is how incapable law enforcement was of sort of unraveling these cases, these stories. They just were not, police departments weren't designed to deal with these kinds of killers. They were set up in a way that, they weren't communicating across jurisdictions. So even within the state of Washington, for example, they weren't sharing information. If somebody gets murdered or disappears in Ellensburg, they're not telling that to the people in Seattle who are investigating. And so it just takes so long for these guys to kind of catch up with what's happening. There's just always a bias also of trivializing what women are telling them.
Yeah.
I find this particularly tragic with, Linda Healy's case. She was one of the first victims in 1974 of Ted Bundy, and she disappears from her bed in the middle of the night, and all the women who were her roommates tell the police she would never have left. She would not have. She's not that kind of person. She's somebody who's really reliable, scholarly, great student, not somebody who's going to take off in the middle of the night. And yet the cops are just saying, oh, she left with her boyfriend, or, they couldn't give the benefit of the doubt, to what they were hearing, which meant that a lot of time was lost in investigating that properly. And they're not putting things together. And so it's that whole era of law enforcement, I think, shows that over and over and over in a lot of these cases.
I don't think that era is necessarily completely gone either. Last year, we did a multi-part series on the serial killer Anthony Sewell in the Cleveland, Ohio area. And there are multiple instances of his victims who had either escaped or he hadn't gone all the way and killed, but he did sexually assault, going straight to the police saying, this man tried to kill me, this man raped me, and nothing was done. Cursory investigation at best. And we're talking 2009, 2010, this isn't the 70s or 80s, right? So,
Sure.
That case created a lot of reforms within the Cleveland Police Department, but I think that's just an example, probably, along with the examples that you're talking about of how the changes that police make in investigating these things never seem to be proactive. They're always reactive. And I think that's also the case with the justice system. And is our system even built to make the change that is needed to? And let's go beyond serial killers. Let's talk about just serial offenders, be they, sexual criminals or, they don't even have to, just violent crime in itself. How do we get more proactive than reactive in listening to women and understanding victims rather than responding after it's too late?
Yeah, and I think you also have to acknowledge that, there's an incredible tendency, to not listen to victims who are from lower socioeconomic status, women who are sex workers, women who are, women of color. I mean, there's
all of which were the case in Sewell, yeah.
Yeah, there's just such a prejudice against anybody who comes from, not an upper class environment, and discounting what they're saying and discounting, their status as victims. That whole case called the Grim Sleeper in Los Angeles, where the killer was preying almost entirely on sex workers who were black or brown, and they just, those cases were not taken seriously by law enforcement, and they weren't even going into those communities and interviewing people, which became really apparent when, a documentary film was done about that case, in which the filmmaker goes and interviews people who had encountered and fought off this guy, and the cops had never spoken to these victims, which is just baffling, and shows you how that persists to this day.
Yeah, and serial killers know that. Serial killers know that those victims aren't going to be looked at too closely. It's an enabling mechanism.
Yeah, it's so true, and really has to change.
And I think that's, just sort of wrap up our conversation. I think this is a good transition to that. You say, and we do this often on our show, we always want to name our victims. You use the phrase, to name is to claim, in your book. And we talk about the way we use language and the way we talk about violence and the way we talk about victims. How do you think the way we use language should change or shift around these crimes and these killers and these victims?
I think that is changing, in the sense that I think a lot of the media have been called out for, preferentially reporting about white victims, for example, white women. But that needs to happen more, and there needs to be more attention to victims who are not white, victims who are not wealthy, or from a background that's middle class or upper middle class. So we just need to do a much better job of that, especially on TV, I think.
Yes.
I think television is particularly prone to kind of whipping up a frenzy about certain cases over others.
How do we find something other than the missing white girl of the day? And there's all this, strum and, okay, let's make a better effort. No effort was ever made. What do you think it is about the missing white girl of the day that television is so addicted to? And I think, you're right. There has been some correction, but there's definitely, I don't think there's been enough. Is it a consumer-focused thing? Is it an easy editorial decision to make? What do you think's behind it?
They're just going with the lowest common denominator, and they're not examining things that I think are much more prevalent and important, such as domestic violence. I mean, domestic violence cases are so much more common. And now, people have, Rachel Louise Snyder has done this in her book about domestic violence, has talked about how often murderers begin by murdering somebody in their family, maybe their mother, or maybe, their wife or girlfriend. And so a lot of mass murders begin, for example, with acts of domestic violence. And domestic violence is something that should be reported on so much more rigorously. And the fact that it is incredibly common and can be linked to these more outrageous, newsworthy examples is something that they just haven't kind of latched onto. And I think that television could do a much, much better job of that. Even if they want to talk about a serial killer or a mass murderer, look at those other connections too, and talk about how prevalent that is in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great place to wrap up here. My last question, which I like to ask everyone, is what should I have asked you that I didn't?
Oh, boy.
You get one.
Yeah, I mean, often people want to know why I, went from writing about Laura Ingalls Wilder in Prairie Fires, and her topics, to writing about serial killers. And I'll just say it was just an object of, real fascination and kind of mystery to me, in part because of what I grew up seeing. There was some domestic violence in my experience, but there were also just really bizarre things happening on Mercer Island where I grew up. This guy blew up his house down the street when I was 8 years old. And that was actually one of the things that I began writing about to begin with, because it remained such a kind of mysterious event from my childhood. Nobody ever explained it. Nobody had any kind of insight into why it might have happened. And I think that was what drew me to the topic, was trying to figure out, is there some explanation? Is there a historical point of view that we could take that would make some sense out of all of this?
Yeah, and I think you did a brilliant job of that in your book, Murderland, and people can find that in the link of this description to this show or in the podcast notes. I've been looking forward to this for a couple of weeks. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for your time and the discussion. Like I said, I'm a nerd for this, so thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.